How's it going, everyone? It's me, Vivi, and welcome to the story of Dr. Neo Cortex. One thing we have to consider: the continuity of the series is questionable. Some might feel like a certain game is not worth mentioning because the information in that game might contradict a game prior to that. And I am fully aware of that, okay? So the ideal thing I'd like to do is simply talk about his general appearances and roles throughout the series, and then we'll try and dive deeper into his past. So with that being said, let's get started. Dr. Neo Cortex, Dr. N Cortex, Dr. Cortex, or N Cortex, or simply Cortex, or Dr. Neo Periwinkle Cortex, a name revealed by Von Clutch in Tag Team Racing. How did Von Clutch even discover his other name? We'd like to assume that sometime in his life, he encountered Von Clutch. That's not far-fetched, right? So basically, all of these differences in his names, the way we pronounce it, that basically sums up the importance Cortex has played in the series. He's the second character next to Crash that represents the series as a whole. There's a cool little trivia I stumbled upon recently. All his initials result in NPC, Neo Periwinkle Cortex, as in non-playable character. Just a cool little fact. Cortex has been the final boss in all games except Twinsanity and Crash of the Titans. That doesn't omit Cortex being a boss prior to that. In fact, both Twinsanity and Crash of the Titans, he's the very first boss you get to face. Cortex throughout the series really gives off psychotic tendencies, overinflated egotism, condescending, manipulator, and a liar, and pretentious. Let's not forget about that one. Cortex had fascination for world domination, clearly shown in the first game, Crash Bandicoot. This is where it's revealed that he tried creating an army of commandos, along with a general. That general turning out to be a failed creation, Crash Bandicoot. Due to his erratic behavior, he wouldn't allow his failed experiment to live to see the day. And he didn't even listen to Brio, who told him that the Evolve Array wasn't ready. Why? Why does he not listen to people? Because he thinks he's always right. And while at it, he also steals credit. For example, Brio perfected the Evolve Array. This was explained in Mind Over Mutant. If we are to believe in Brio, of course. We at least know that Cortex in the second game says that Brio created the Evolve Array. I don't know if you've watched the video where I talk about Brio's past and all that. It is implied that Brio is the creator. The first sight of Cortex trying to build an Evolve Array, well, that was in Twinsanity at the Academy of Evil. When he was 8 years old at the Academy, he tried evolving his pets Victor and Moritz into, I guess, smarter creatures. Instead, his prototype failed and sent his pets to the 10th dimension. And guess what? They held a grudge against him for that in Twinsanity. As for the lying, manipulative nature of Cortex, we get to see that in the second game, where he pretended he was nicer and told Crash to gather crystals to help the world. Cortex was pretending to have stumbled upon a force that would destroy the planet. He went as far as to say that him wanting world domination in the first game was because of Brio forcing him. We see some of his erratic behavior when Crash fails, how he raises the tone of his voice, and psychotic episodes as well. Although Cortex seemed like the evil scientist all high and mighty all the time, he did show signs of weakness, aka fear. In Warped, he was scared of Uka Uka, Aku Aku's brother, who seemed to have worked with Cortex in the past, or at least had some sort of connection with Cortex. With no more crystals and gems in the picture, Cortex was begging for forgiveness because Uka Uka was mad. The Time Twister machine is built with entropy in that game, and in the true ending of this game, after collecting all the gems, Cortex, Uka Uka, and entropy get sucked into the vortex. Everything gets sucked in, including the machine, and they end up in this place, as babies. You wonder why a baby such as Cortex has a beard? Well, we'll blame it on the Time Twister's alterations, alright? As for Crash Team Racing, well, we imagine that Entropy, being an infant, with Uka Uka's guidance, they managed to return to the present. I mean, that's honestly still a mystery on how they actually came back to the present. As for Crash Team Racing, we'd like to believe he helped the gang win races against Nitrus Oxide. Knowing Cortex's nature, he wouldn't allow anyone else other than him to dominate the world. Or destroy it, basically. Crash Bash, he ends up on the evil team. Not surprising at all. As for Wrath of Cortex, which we like to believe takes place after Warped, him, Tropy Uka Uka, who he's still afraid of. There's also Tiny, and Jin and Dingodile. At this point we wonder how he can even tolerate Tiny and Dingodile. And Jin we can understand. But these two, I guess Cortex had a soft side for them. Anywho, they have a meeting in this game. Uka Uka mentions how Cortex's evil status has been going downhill as of late. They want to get rid of Crash. Now during their meeting, Cortex's secret weapon gets revealed. We later figure out that it's Crash Bandicoot, enhanced with the elementals. In the end, of course, Crash Bandicoot wins, and Crunch joins the family. And Cortex's space station gets destroyed. Uka Uka and Cortex end up in, which Cortex calls the Antarctic. Twinsanity seems to be a direct sequel to Wrath of Cortex, where it's likely that him being frozen was the aftermath of these two being stuck in that icy place. However, before Twinsanity, we had 4 games. Crash Bandicoot: The Huge Adventure. The plot of that game minimizing planet Earth. Crash Bandicoot 2: Entranced. He's a playable character in multiplayer mode. Crash Nitro Kart. Everyone's abducted by Emperor Velo, forced to compete in the Galaxy Circuit. Eventually, Team Cortex gets stranded, and most likely found their way home afterwards. We also had a crossover with Spyro, titled Crash Bandicoot Purple: Ripto's Rampage. And you guessed it, Ripto teaming up with Cortex to stop their respective enemies, Spyro and Crash. Cortex helps Ripto genetically modify his Riptox to appear as Crash and Spyro. You know, you can guess what happens next. Crash and Spyro eventually realize what's going on, so they help each other out. And now comes Twinsanity. Cortex lures Crash dressed up as Coco, who he basically froze before doing that. This is an iconic moment of Cortex. He tells him he's been stranded 3 years alone in the Antarctic waste. That's a lie, because Uka Uka was technically frozen with him during the start menu. There he surprises Crash by gathering all his previous foes. One starts to wonder why even Oxide. From what I recall, Oxide was Cortex's foe as well. As for Crunch, well, let's just say he got tricked and really thought this was a party for Crash. You know, birthday party. Their little get-together moment leads them to fall inside a cave. They ultimately team up together in this game in order to stop the evil twins, Victor and Moritz, from destroying the island. Cortex doubts it at first. They take out his brain, and they call it a mind game. Some sort of illusion trick, I'd like to believe. The fact Cortex reacts without his brain attached to his head, I mean, you gotta wonder. Is that actually his brain, or is that some sort of mind trickery? You know, an object resembling a brain. You even gotta wonder how the heck did Cortex manage to put his brain back into his head. And right there, we see that fear side of Cortex. I mean, to give him credit, his brain was out. Cortex apparently had built a lair in that Antarctic waste. One wonders, okay, how the heck was he able to do that? I guess we have the penguins to thank for. They're after the crystal in this scene. Why? Because their pay is basically absent at this point. Cortex breaks the fourth wall here, mentioning that Wrath didn't do so well. Uka Uka gets accidentally freed. He tries to kill Crash and Cortex this time. They all eventually team up, Uka and Aku especially, wanting to turn in Cortex to the twins, so that they spare their lives. This is when Cortex wants to rely on Crash's support, saying how he's nurtured him, like how he's been a father figure to him. Knowing Cortex, these are just pretty little words. And he did say he tried to kill him. They eventually seek out Nina to try and fix the Psychotron, Nina being at the Academy of Evil. Also, Nina being at the Academy of Evil was Cortex's doing. Why? Because he thought his niece was too kind-hearted in nature. He wanted her to develop a bad behavior. Once they reach the Academy, Emberly stumbles upon Cortex and says he's always a vermin and a crybaby. Cortex responds by saying, "But I'm an evil scientist." The way he says it, he sounds desperate to falsify Emberly's statement.
I'm an evil scientist!
Cortex, who always wants to be on top and superior, he has a fearful side to him. And just this scene alone, right? After dealing with the twins in the 10th dimension, Cortex reassures Crash that his existence is just a pain. He tries to send off Crash somewhere, but ultimately the machine crashes down, and Cortex wounds up in Crash's brain. Crash Boom Bang. He's an unlockable character. Let's move on to Crash of the Titans. This is where you wonder what in tarnation happened to Cortex. Well, apart from his design overhaul, he relies on Mojo, which he steals to turn the inhabitants into Titans. Uka Uka sees Cortex as weaker than his niece Nina. She takes over eventually, and plans to basically continue with Cortex's original plan to destroy the Wumpa Islands, using the Dominator. In the end, Cortex forgives his daughter, niece, right? Crash Mind over Mutant. It's still Mojo themed. Cortex's scheme has to do again with brainwashing the citizens, this time by re-teaming up with Brio to produce the NV, a mind-controlled device. In a cancelled Crash game called Landed, basically a reboot which was originally planned for PlayStation 3, Xbox, and Wii, it would have followed the story of Crash, a mutated Bandicoot, trying to rescue his other Bandicoot family, technically called the Bandicoots, which were purely critters by nature. Critters which weren't put under the Evolve Array and all that. Basically, long story short, that game was completely shut down by Activision, because they thought the game was going nowhere due to its early development. They did acquire Sierra back then, Radical Entertainment, the developer under Sierra, so ultimately everything got acquired. Look, if you're interested in this cancelled game, there's more detail over on Crash Mania. Feel free to check it out. The last sight of Cortex before the remakes happened, Skylanders Imaginators. For the 20th anniversary of Crash Bandicoot, a crossover with Skylanders happened. The event was called the Synchronization Celebration. The story of Thumpin' Wumpa Islands was that everything on their island, apparently every 20 years this happens, it was synchronized with the powerful rhythmic energies of the island. This is what Vicarious Visions narrative lead David Rodriguez had to say about the matter. At least for Cortex. We couldn't bring back Crash without reviving his old nemesis, Dr. Neo Cortex. The not-so-good doctor has constructed a machine to harness the rhythmic energies of Wumpa Islands during the Synchronization Celebration. Once properly channeled, he'll be able to use his Matrix Chamber to create an army of loyal minions to carry out his most dastardly of wishes. Unfortunately, his plan goes a little haywire when one of Cortex's minions shows up unannounced. Fake Crash was basically the problem. Cortex ends up working for the Skylanders as a result. The Crash series, it's gone through a lot of changes, and that's pretty obvious. I don't know whether to call it sad or unnecessary. For example, since we're focusing on Cortex right now, they've used him way too much. Too much, in fact, they had to alter his character in exchange. Not only design-wise, but character-wise. Cortex started off as a more confident type of guy with his evil doings. I mean, especially the PS1 looking Cortex. When I was a kid, he used to give me the creeps, especially looking at those low poly teeth. In the original trilogy, Cortex simply wanted total world domination. As the series went on, he's become more of a comical type of villain, Twinsanity being the first, which honestly, it's not bad. The mindset the developers had at this point, hey, since Cortex is so important, let's throw him in another game, but this time, let's have Crash and him work together. Why? Because they probably thought that Cortex was being way overused. So I'd like to believe that Traveler's Tales had that mindset, to involve Cortex, but to bring in something new. Him teaming up with Crash, like I just said. To be honest, comparing voices, Brandon O'Brien from the first original game, Clancy Brown, and Lex Lang afterwards, his old voice had a more sinister tone to it. Low poly design combined. When looking at Crash 2 and 3 especially, he still had that vibe going on in his voice with Clancy Brown. But why the change in voice, you might say? Was it intentional? Well, there were interviews regarding the matter according to the trivia section on Wiki. According to Clancy Brown, during an interview, he stated the reason why he stopped doing the voice of Dr. Cortex was that Universal gave minimum wages to the actors, and that he was never told about the Crash games, Wrath of Cortex and Crash Nitro Kart, during the time. Another reason for Lex Lang replacing Clancy Brown was that in an interview, Lex Lang stated that parents didn't like Clancy's impersonation of the character and thought it was too mean for younger audiences and wrote letters to Universal about the problem. What Lex Lang explained during that interview, Universal had told him they want him voicing Cortex. Why? To make him appear like he's more absorbed with himself, more of a maniacal narcissist, about how he's going to rule the world. That's certainly the vibe he gave off with Lex Lang as his voice actor, and I really like Lex Lang as his voice actor. I don't have anything against it. I like both. Clancy Brown brought something and then we have Lex Lang. I just like both. If I were to pick, for the rest of the series, I honestly wouldn't mind having Lex Lang from now on. So with all of his general roles and involvement in the series out of the way, now is the time where we dive into the Crash Bandicoot, what we like to call it, Bible. Like my previous videos on certain characters, there are 3 versions of Cortex's past. The earliest one being Joe Pearson's, one of the original artists on Crash Bandicoot, his initial pitch. The second version, which was released to the public, Project Wombat from 1995. And the last one being Crash Bandicoot Files. So for the sake of relevancy, as always, we'll put more emphasis on the updated version of Cortex's history. One thing, however, Pearson's version is almost exactly the same as the Files version. If you're ever interested with the 1995 Project Wombat version, I will leave the link in the description below. It is pretty different compared to the Files version, so I'm not really going to focus on that version. So let me start off with the most updated one, called the Crash Bandicoot Files. The story in that art book states that Cortex simply wanted total world domination. Anyone below his delusionary status didn't deserve to be on top. Cortex always had this ultimate leader mindset. He was tired of being humiliated by humanity. This could have been a result of how he was raised and treated as a kid, which we'll get into soon. He doesn't tolerate any sort of failure. He's maniacal. He does have periods of depression. Once we go over his past, it wouldn't surprise me that his mind shifts to dark places sometimes. Dark meaning his own inner demons. His quote-unquote only friend was and still is Brio. Cortex is a lifelong loner. The closest thing he has to a human friend is his assistant and childhood associate, Brio, whom he treats with contemptuous affection of a master to a pet, when he's not screaming at him. In an odd way, we feel for Cortex and his frustrations. His sole reason for living is to achieve world domination, but his schemes are constantly going awry. We almost pity him when Willy and the henchmen ruin his brilliant plans. Willy was the original name for Crash, if you're unaware. Now, as for Pearson's initial pitch, there's a section I want to bring up. It mentions Carmen, aka the original name for Tana. For the first time in years, Cortex found himself drawn to a female. The fact that Carmen is not human is even better, for Cortex has been at war with humanity for his entire life. Carmen's disinterest in her creator and growing affection for Willy have not deterred the diminutive genius one bit. Neo Cortex is confident that once Willy is eliminated, Carmen will see Neo as the soulmate he knows he is. Okay, now as you can see on the side, there's a note saying that Cortex didn't have a love interest. Whatever Cortex was imagining in his head, I just don't think Tana would have stuck with Cortex. Anywho, let's continue. To say that Neo Cortex comes from a troubled childhood would be an understatement. The youngest son in a large family of circus clowns, Cortex was born during the show at Smiling Jimmy's Traveling Circus and immediately thrown into the act. Imagine young Cortex's confusion. No sooner was he out of the womb than he was covered with grease paint and a bright orange nose was planted on his face. Seconds later, hundreds of people were laughing at him. His 20 brothers and sisters were all extroverts and natural comedians like mom and dad, and quickly adapted to life under the big top. Little Neo Cortex, however, was highly introverted, a sickly child who liked to read science books and play with his erector sets. His siblings, parents, and the other circus performers tormented him mercilessly for his quiet ways, making him the butt of endless and cruel clown jokes. At the age of 3, they tattooed a large N for nerd on his forehead. They continued to make him an unwilling participant in the family act, humiliating him nightly before a gleeful public. Because of his diminutive stature, Cortex was forced to wear a monkey suit and walk on all fours. While other children were getting their first bicycle, young Neo Cortex was being shot out of cannons. Other children were taking accordion lessons and riding ponies while Neo was subjected to the torment of the seltzer bottle and the pie in the face, not to mention the endless banana jokes. This torture abruptly ended when Cortex was 5, and his entire family was wiped out by a quote-unquote freak explosion of the circus's fireworks supply. Alas, Smiling Jimmy's circus was no more, though the memory lingers. To this very day, an image of a clown, a canned laugh, a seltzer bottle, or a banana will send Neo into a hysterical rage. In Pearson's version, his pitch, his mom and dad were gym teachers, and his brothers were jocks. As for the 1995 version, the idea of a clown family was still present. Alright, now we can at least understand where his egomaniacal personality comes from. Cortex, the moment he was born, he was thrown into a circus act. Talk about trauma, that's one. 2, he never had the chance to fully experience what it actually is to live, to grow up. Being tossed around, pies in the face at a young age, being shot out of cannon? I mean, come on. That to me sounds like that's the only awful taste of life and development Cortex went through. No wonder he hasn't developed in a way where people actually would admire him. He just blames humanity for being so harsh because of how he was treated as a kid. The way his mind developed, his family's harsh, then that automatically equates to the humanity being harsh as well. If his flesh and blood is like that, then that poor innocent child had a troubled, messed up childhood. Parental abuse and humiliation can really affect a child's brain development. Cortex, being the introvert, the only thing he had that made him happy was reading science books. And at the age of 5, quote-unquote, a freak accident happened. Are we to believe that Cortex actually murdered his family? I mean, at the age of 5, if he did kill his family, he was still young. He could have been a kid that gained satisfaction out of it. Wow, explosions. Plus the fact that he completely despised his family. He was 5. He lacked mental stability. He reads science books. I wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with those fireworks going wrong. After the death of his family of circus clowns, Cortex found an abandoned bean factory. He lived off canned beans and rainwater. Eventually, he wanted to enroll himself in a local high school called Sunnyvale High. He wanted to seek education. He was made fun of, since he was the brains, and was basically the outcast of the school. The only bond he had was with his friend Brio. A time comes where Brio and Cortex were away from school, and the school happens to blow up. Again, quote-unquote freak explosion was used. How did the explosion happen? Well, the school apparently had a nuclear power plant. And due to the explosion, his education to Sunnyvale High lasted 2 years. Then began the years of wandering as Cortex and Brio traveled the world in search of a place that they could call home, or maybe just a good can of beans. They trekked the farthest Himalayas in search of arcane knowledge and were booted out of the monasteries throughout. They safaried through deepest Africa and were run out of countless villages on bamboo rails. They tried to make the scene at the Viper Club in LA, but never even got close to the doors. Wherever they went, a mysterious series of violent explosions and catastrophes followed. Eventually, this came to the attention of various international law agencies, and Cortex and Brio were soon on the most wanted list of every country in the world. Seeking refuge from this unwanted popularity, they ran aground on the Lemurian Islands, where they began construction of Castle Cortex and the Evolve Array. After years of struggle and effort, Cortex stands ready to realize his dreams, if he could only get rid of that pesky wombat. So eventually, the population realizes that wherever these two go, there's some explosions happening. So it is likely that he did actually murder his family. Alright, now how do we explain the Academy of Evil? 1. This piece of concept work featuring Cortex and Brio. Yes, there's Engine, okay. And this scene from Twinsanity. He was 8 years old, according to his words. When he joined Sunnyvale High, he was 6, and the school lasted 2 years, so he was 8 years old after the explosion happened. Can we believe that at a younger age, he joined the Academy of Evil? And this time around, Cortex was actually scared of someone, Madame Amberly. Cortex was experimenting with the Evolve Array. Perhaps he thought the Academy would be a perfect spot, the first perfect spot to explore the world, what it can offer. Not to mention the spooky Grand Prix, Beanox did share this piece of artwork. We notice Amberly and Cortex's clown suit, which reinforces the idea that Cortex did attend the Academy despite what the Bible states. And what about Nina? If you notice, her picture is scotch-taped. Nina, according to Twinsanity, Nina was sent to the Academy of Evil so that her behavior would become bad, right? We could imagine that on that photo someone took Nina's picture and taped it on it. But here comes the problem, the contradictory part. Twinsanity states he was 8 at the Academy when he was trying to work with a prototype of the Evolve Array, but the Bible states he was 8 when the first explosion happened in his high school. Did he mistakenly, let's just say, remember that he was 8 at the Academy? Maybe he was younger? Cortex is known for lying, to feed his ego, right? He wanted to believe he was older. What do you think of that theory? And what about Nina? Is she his daughter or niece? I'll leave Neo Cortex for a separate video, I'm not gonna dive too much into that, but all I want to say is, yes, these two are apparently family. Daughter or niece? As he spelled out in Twinsanity, it's likely he doesn't want to mention the title daughter, as he simply isn't capable of dealing with his daughter. So instead he goes with the title uncle, someone who feels like doesn't have to handle that much responsibility. However, the manual and the Prima official guide for Twinsanity, they both state that Nina is his niece. Was it really a slip of the tongue moment in Twinsanity? Or he just refuses to acknowledge that Nina is in fact his daughter, and that he was married, probably, sometime during his youth. The age of Cortex is currently unknown. Can we fit in what Von Klotch said to Cortex? You know the name Periwinkle? Since his age is unknown, he looks old, so we'd like to believe, speculate, that he did cross paths with Von Klotch sometime in his life. So with that being said, guys, this is it for the story of Dr. Neo Periwinkle Cortex. So if I missed anything interesting in particular, please say so in the comments. If there's some stuff you don't agree with, tell me why. Give me your own take on it, alright? So with that being said, I've been Vivi, and thank you so much for your support. Until next time.